This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Erik Spanberg, in for Mike Collins. From Harpers Ferry to Havana, yes, Havana, author and historian Imani Perry explores the South all the way to Cuba in her latest book. It's called South to America, a journey below the Mason-Dixon to understand the soul of a nation. Perry is a professor of African American studies at Princeton University, but she is originally from Alabama. Her book counters the conventional wisdom that has long held that the South and its long history of racial prejudice and violence stand apart from the rest of the nation. Blending her own reporting and reflection with historical correctives, Perry shows the reader again and again the willful ignorance that has helped fuel systemic inequity. Imani means faith, and after sharing the weight of history borne by Perry in her travels, you will have no doubt about her faith that the long struggle for a fairer nation must never be abandoned. Imani Perry, welcome to Charlotte Talks.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we get into the book and your travels, I should mention that you earned a PhD and a law degree from Harvard, and you also have degrees from Yale and Georgetown, which means I'm highly unqualified to speak with you today.
No, not at all. But I did like school quite a bit.
I want to begin by asking you about a passage at the end of South to America. You write this, quote, "We teach people how to live with the daily heartbreak on your chest and still laugh and find the pleasure in cursing out somebody who deserves it," end quote. Does that attitude help you stay sane given how slowly progress moves?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think that is a kind of sustenance. And I also think it's a sustenance across the board, given in particular how, Southerners on average are more vulnerable than people in other regions. We have greater poverty, more illness and the like, and there's a disposition for living through adversity that I think is actually an incredibly, it moves me deeply, but it's also a lesson for how to, the making do is also a spiritual exercise of sorts,
Yes. And, it's always interesting to see how things connect, which is what this book is about. Obviously, all the tentacles of history and connections, some recognized and some unknown. But when I first heard about your book, the title instantly made me think of Willie Morris's North Toward Home, which, of course, is a Mississippian's reflection on leaving the South and going to New York in the 60s. And then as I read your book, I learned about the conversation that you were having with Albert Murray, the social and literary essayist who wrote South to a Very Old Place. And then, as I'm sure you probably know, but I did not, that started with an assignment from Willie Morris at Harpers Magazine. So, so that's a long, go ahead. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how all this gestated with you as you were getting started on this.
Sure. I mean, I feel very connected to Albert Murray. And this piece started with an assignment from Harpers, which was, I wrote a piece about Alabama specifically. But there's this, literally over 100 years of writings where people travel to the South or through the South. And I'm fascinated by that as a tradition, in part because so often, I think what it is there's this sort of curiosity about the South because Southerners are such good storytellers and because it's seen as this sort of fascinating, different region. It has a kind of sensibility often of travel narratives to other parts of the world, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to kind of play with that, but also provoke with it, turn it on its head to say, well, actually, this is a place you can go to understand your own nation and the ways in which it has been, it has masqueraded itself by its decision to keep the nation, the national mythology to keep the South at a distance. But in fact, it's not just this is where it begins, right? The whole kind of concept of this country begins in the South, but it's also the region that has driven it because it is a place of such geographic abundance and prosperity, right? There was a desire to harness this land, right? And to do so meant a lot of innovative things and also a lot of tragic things. And so I wanted to step into that tradition, but step into the tradition in ways that would be a provocation. And that's partially what Albert Murray did too. I mean, he was sort of a different point. I mean, he was sort of like trying to, in 1971, return home. He's also was an Alabamian, Alabamian, as they say now, but I prefer Alabamian. He was also an Alabamian, and he was trying to push back against the kind of sociological read of what was happening with race, and try to think about the cultural and historic resonances and the complicated landscape. And even though I didn't always agree with his political assessments, I like the understanding that it's a complicated landscape, that you can't just tell a traditional political story to understand the South. You can't tell a linear story. You can't tell a binary story of black and white. It's a really complicated hybrid Creole landscape.
We don't go for linear stories in the South, as you know.
Not at all.
Thus William Faulkner.
That's right. Even paths, yes.
As you say, this book, what's interesting is you clearly love the South. Anyone who's just heard you the past few minutes can recognize that. But this book spares no one. And I think what's most provocative is your assertion that you've already mentioned, that the South is not an outlier, it's emblematic. And it reminded me of MLK's quote after he had gone up to Chicago taking on redlining and lack of economic mobility. And he said then, quote, "I think the people from Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate." Is there still some truth to that statement?
Oh, yes. I mean, and I tell the story, and it's funny because I've gotten a lot of resistance to this, unsurprisingly. But my own experience, I moved up to Massachusetts with my mother for her to go to graduate school. So all my family, for the most part, is in the South, except for sort of one or two people. I don't come from a great migration family, which I think is important, because there is a narrative that I think is partially true, but I want to trouble it, that, Black people left the South and left Jim Crow and the Great Migration. Right? Now, the problem with that narrative is a couple of things. One is it's always been the case that the majority of African Americans live in the South, still did before, right? And so that has sort of taken over the story of Black America in some ways that I think needs to be pulled back a little bit. And also people moved in large part because of work, because of the impact of the boll weevil. It wasn't just Jim Crow. I mean, there are people who left because of racial violence, and also white Southerners left in comparable numbers, in some places, many more numbers, to the Midwest, right? So this idea, and the problem is the idea that there was an escape from racism has become part of the narrative of the Great Migration. My own experience is that I experienced much more egregious racism in New England than I ever did in the South, right? In terms of racial slurs and bottles being thrown at the car. I mean, we got to Massachusetts right after the busing crisis, right? Which was violent. And frankly, it could be terrifying, right? And so part of I don't say that, some people have asked me, well, are you absolving the South in saying that? No, I'm actually saying that there are ways that we have of organizing race in the society that, of course, were learned and perfected in the place where the majority of African Americans once lived, right? And that these become national norms, and they're not exclusively set, but it's also the case that it's important to do a kind of corrective to history, because right now, for example, Southern schools are more integrated than any other region of the country, right? I mean, there's more, that there's more segregation and there's as much racial violence in other regions. And so we have to get out of that mythology that sort of, because otherwise it allows other regions to absolve themselves of what is a national or even global problem.
That's the voice of Imani Perry. She's my guest today, and she's the author of the new book, South to America, which I should mention is also on the New York Times bestseller list. Hard for me to say. I want to ask you to that last point, whether you have any concerns that people will sort of misappropriate what you're saying and turn it into, from a Southern perspective, oh, well, see, it's not us, it's them. It's, no way could you read the book and make that point, but just, because the book is getting attention, will people try and steer it in that direction?
Sure. I mean, everything gets misappropriated these days, right? I mean, right? And especially because social media allows you to take out a single sentence and decontextualize so that's always a risk. what I hope though is that anybody who reads the book, and I think I've tried to write a book that anybody who reads it, irrespective of whether they agree with me, will be willing to walk with me, right? So this is why the book is not an argument book. This book is an exploration book. I'm bringing people with me through encounters with individuals, with places, and to allow themselves to re-encounter, right? To rethink, to be destabilized in what they assume is going to happen or what they assume did happen, and try to sort of open up conversation, right? And so so my hope is less that I will convince people of a particular reading and more that I will encourage more and more conversations. And so to that end, if someone says, oh, well, see, this then, but I hope somebody else will respond and say, but she raises this question where she talks about the freedom movement and why this didn't happen. And so I'm hoping that it doesn't end there. Right.
I want to ask you, I've been sort of going along these lines of questions, speaking about the South as a monolithic entity, when, as you point out in the book, it is anything but. And you write, quote, I have learned in the course of my travels that there are Souths, plural as much as singular, despite my deep South bias. I know that while the South is a determined thing, it is also a shifting and varied one, end quote. So what examples come to mind when you think of that?
Well, certainly that I went, and I say this in the Maryland chapter, when I lived in Maryland, I never thought of Maryland as the South. Never. I mean, it was just, it was like, okay, I'm still in the Northeast. And this is really interesting because I'm a professor of African-American studies. I teach Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, people who were enslaved in Maryland, right? Mm-hmm. And I think of it as relative, I think of it in terms of the North, at least I did. And so so when I went to Appalachia, when I was in Maryland, when I was, and then also I had an expansion when I was in the Caribbean, I was trying to think in terms of the South as a region defined by what could be grown where, and what could be, and what was, where the kind of prosperity, the engine. I thought of this because South, so much of the history is about it being the nation's breadbasket. And so that sensibility in the shaping of the development of the nation sort of made me see, okay, not only are there Souths plural, but the way in which the different regions develop different characteristics is shaped by what could be grown there or what could be gleaned from the earth there, right? And that helped me. And then so I was like, okay, well, once I started thinking about tobacco and that changed and the same with North Carolina, because I will be completely honest, in Alabama, there are people who refer to North Carolina as upstate, right? Which of course is the South, but it's like, there are these biases that come from whether you're from cotton country or tobacco country or sugar or what have you. And so,
well, I'm originally from Louisiana. It took me about 15 years to get used to the winters here. So yeah, I understand. Thinking North Carolina. Again, my guest is Imani Perry. She is the author of the new book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, we're going to ask Imani to talk to us about her travels way up north to North Carolina, which, of course, is actually south for her now that she is at Princeton University. But we'll see what she found and what she learned here in the Old North State when we return here on Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
And support comes from WFAE members and Tryon Medical Partners, an independent practice with a focus on doctor-patient relationships. Tryon Medical Partners has more than 100 physicians and 9 locations throughout the region. Details at tryonmed.com. And Live Nation, presenting Rod Stewart with special guest Cheap Trick, Friday, August 26th at PNC Music Pavilion. Tickets on sale this Friday at 10 a.m. at livenation.com. On the next Charlotte Talks local news roundup, a 3-judge panel decides on voter maps. CMS votes unanimously to end its indoor mask mandate effective March 7th. City Council gives the okay to a set of controversial rezoning petitions. Authorities ID a suspect in the shooting death of a Cats bus driver, and Charlotte area athletes make a splash at the NBA All-Star Game and at the Daytona 500. Those and other stories tomorrow at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
WFAE invites you to a special live event Tuesday, March 8th. Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles and others will join Charlotte Talks host Mike Collins for Equilibrium, a candid conversation about race and equity. And on February 28th, we'll hope you'll join us for a special virtual announcement about our race and equity team. Details and registration for both events at WFAE.org. Major support for WFAE's race and equity team comes from Wells Fargo.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins. My guest today is Imani Perry. She is professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, and she is the author of the new book, South to America. As I mentioned, we need to talk a little bit about your visit to North Carolina. Your North Carolina chapter is titled Tobacco Road and the Bible Belt. And of course, those of us in Charlotte and Raleigh and other urban parts of the state may be susceptible to crying out in protest. That's what North Carolina used to be. Yeah. So how did you decide on that title? As I conveniently neglect to mention that the Billy Graham Library is one of Charlotte's most popular attractions.
Of course it is. I think this is part of what every chapter is focused around a question that I want to complicate. And this narrative I had heard was, and this is part of why I saw North Carolina as different in some way, is because, when we were coming, North Carolina, like it was the way that people talk about Georgia now, Georgia blue, right? North Carolina is going to be this different place because all of these Northerners are moving to the South. And that, of course, is dependent upon a kind of a set of ideas that I already think are questionable about sort of a North-South cultural divide that then will transform, Northerners will come and transform the South as a problematic formulation. Mm-hmm. It's driven in part by the way we do this red state, blue state map stuff, which is sort of makes it look like the whole nation is in purple, which it is. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that there's this long history, not just of it's not just a question of racism, but of racial violence in North Carolina, that is not just it's not just Wilmington 1898, it's Wilmington 1971, it's 2012, and it's this idea. And for me, in some ways, what it boils down to as a kind of philosophical or theological thing is this concept that I use in the book, which is this question of the God of masters versus the God of slaves. It is a deeply religious region that North Carolina is in so many ways the heart of the development of this sort of Christian theology in this country, right? And so many different figures and that there are competing conceptions of Christianity that dominate. And then, of course, I also talk about the history of Islam to some extent in the state, which was one of the submerged histories. But that you can take the same sort of underlying theology, but you can have a conception of God that is organized around hierarchies between human beings, or you can have a conception of God that is organized around what it means to deeply love thy neighbor. And these things have always been in conflict in the history of the state. And we can see through examples, right? And so that was a piece of it. But I also wanted to kind of trouble the way that we talk about universities all the way through the book, and they appear in various ways. And so, so to think about Silent Sam, but also to think about, Duke's campus and Julian Abley, a Black, architect who designed so much of the campus, but couldn't be on campus to be recognized for his designs. And that, I think that this part of what I hope comes from it is that there is not a tension, or there's not a conflict between a progressive part of the South in terms of development and a history of racism. Of course there's not, because the development of the nation depended upon racism. And right, so why would one think that there's a necessary conflict? The question is, what are the ethics that we're going to embrace moving forward as we develop and grow, right? That's the question. Can we learn from history that we can detach the idea of building and growing from brutal usage of people in that process? That seems to me to be the real question. And can we have a kind of more inclusive and there's a lot about building as a metaphor in that chapter.
I want to go back to where you started in that answer, which is, this idea of people coming from all parts of the country to North Carolina. It's been one of the fastest growing states for the past 30 years. Here in Charlotte, 120 people a day are moving here. So yes, all of that is going on, and we hear purple state. But, Trump won here in 2016, in 2020, and Barack Obama did win North Carolina, but it was only the first time he ran. It was by a handful of votes, and that was the first time a Democrat had won here since Jimmy Carter. Mitt Romney won in 2012. Without making this into a political seminar, I'm really interested in this idea that you write about in the book, which is that local cultures and power structures are remarkably resilient. Expand a little bit on that and how a place like North Carolina, which all evidence would make you think is going to turn into Ohio or Pennsylvania or Western New York, has not.
Right. Well, I mean, Pennsylvania, they call I live in Pennsylvania. Once you get out of Philly, they call it Pennsyltucky. Right? And that's used as a pejorative, but I think it's one of those things that's true. Like so I'll just say it's also a battleground state.
Yes. You remember James Carville said that it was Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Alabama in between. No offense.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. No offense. Yes. I mean, it's not very much like Alabama, but
you can't trust James Carville.
Yeah. But I do think that one of the things we miss in the political discourse and the way that it's a binary, right, is how people are moved and move about politically, right? So, people make decisions, one, based upon the grooves that are preset, right? So when they talk during election season about, racial dog whistles I think the thing that we have to keep in mind is that, yes, there are ways in which people are moved about by race and this idea of there being a zero-sum game, and the idea particularly, when people talk about white Southerners who conceive of the Democratic Party as being sort of a party that's for Black people or for the brown people, right? People get moved about by that, right? Because of the relative, and I know this. There is a way in which if the community is largely vulnerable and feels as though the government is not going to do much to help them, and that then maybe they can get a little bit of advantage or at least not so much disadvantage as some others, that's a very common sort of American political calculus, right, about others. And I think it really is at work, but I also think the other piece of it is, and I in my head, it exists in this way because I don't have more eloquent language, but when people have struggled, it is not surprising that they put more faith in prayer than politicians. And that so that political actions, when people say, oh, well, folks vote against their interests, I think political actions are not seen as yielding outcomes that change the quality of their lives in general, right? And I think that so then the actions are not, they cannot be read in the way that we are encouraged to read them as a sign of thinking X, Y, or Z will happen, right? Like that doesn't seem there. Instead, they're sort of statements, they're assertions about membership and identity. And so people get triggered, and people also feel hopeful at times, and people also are very doubtful, I think, that who is the president has a direct impact on their lives across the board. And so as a result, there are just habits that are formed. But we also have these incredible moments, and I think it is so, and this is part of why I also wanted to talk about white Southerners in the civil rights movement, which almost never happens. And I write some in the book because we have these incredible moments historically. We have Highlander Folk School. We have these places where people have crossed the lines, the borders of race, and talked about the conditions of workers, and talked about equality, and talked about what it means to be able to build a beloved community, that have been incredibly impactful and from the South to the rest of the world. And I think we need to lay claim to that as our heritage. in an explicit way, and not let it go. You know, I think it's, which also means re-narrating the history of the 20th century, frankly, you know.
Again, that is the voice of Imani Perry. She is the author of the new book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. Let me back up a little bit. I think that from reading the book, you went to Durham, Chapel Hill, and Wilmington. Were those your main stops in North Carolina?
Yeah.
Tell me why you chose those particular places.
Well, those are just places that I, for one reason or another, have gone a lot. When I returned, I tried to not do that many places for the first time because I was concerned about making sure that I got an accurate feel. But part of it is because, you know, as an academic, those are the places that, like, you know, that I am encouraged to go and to read in a particular way. And I wanted to read them differently, right, than I had, right? And I almost went to Duke for graduate school and I visited a bunch of times. And so there's this sort of, there's a way in which it was just kind of, you know, what made sense, where I knew people, where I could catch a likeness of the place most easily. And then Wilmington, because it's just so significant, right?
Sure.
Yeah. But there, you know, this is such, like, I was in Columbia, South Carolina yesterday, and I was like, oh, I wish I had been, you know, there's just so many places that I didn't get to go that I wish I had gone, but maybe in the future.
You mentioned Duke. There is a lighter moment, Neufchâtel.
Yes, Neufchâtel cheese. Oh my goodness, I know. Yeah.
For the audience, what was going on there?
So I had been admitted to Duke's program in literature for graduate school, and I went there. And first of all, like, I was like, this is not, I thought, oh, I'm going south, you know, whatever that'll be. And everybody was dressed in black. And they were talking about Neufchâtel cheese. I had never heard of it. I didn't know what they were talking about. And I was like, these people are too fancy. Like, I called my mom crying. I was like, I'm not going to go to graduate school. These people, you know, because it was so, you know, snooty. And I should say that was that department, because I also met people in other departments later. I don't want to characterize the entire graduate school in that way, but it was very intimidating. But that was also important for me to include, because on the flip side, there's a characterization. Like, I was just in Mississippi and I had on black, and someone said, well, you're just dressed like a transplant from New York said, you dress like you're from New York. And I was thinking, there are plenty of people who wear all black in the South. But yeah, it was a hilarious moment. In retrospect, back then it was like a crisis moment.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it is funny, but in another way, it illustrates, you know, the power of classism and all the things that go into being accepted and not feeling accepted. Right. South, North.
And there's so many layers. There's different forms of classism and elitism, right? Because there was a certain kind of elite world that I anticipated at Duke, right? A kind of preppy elite. I did not anticipate this sort of Europhile experience.
Now, your only sin in North Carolina that I want to go over with you, other than skipping Charlotte, of course,
was my mistake.
Is that you mistakenly referred to Michael Jordan's first national championship occurring on March 30th, 1981, when it was in 1982.
Thank you for pointing it out. Yes.
Well, I'm sure you'll fix it in the paperback and it'll all be okay. Yes. As you probably know, Michael Jordan owns the Charlotte Hornets. I'm sure he's an avid listener. He's probably going to call in a minute and just settle it with you. But
I know,
in case Michael does not call in the next few minutes to sort this out with you, I am curious, what do you think of Michael Jordan as a cultural figure, particularly because during his playing days, he was criticized a lot for not being more active, for not being more political. And certainly it was a different time compared to what you see with LeBron James and the current crop of NBA players. But what do you think about Michael Jordan as a cultural figure?
So this is a great question. It just drives that era has like woken me up in the middle of the night for more nights than you can imagine.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. I'm so glad, because I was hoping you could mention it so I could like make public. I know it's a mistake in the book. I think about Jordan. I thought about him a lot when I was writing, which is part of why the mistake is so horrifying me. But I thought about him a lot because I, of course, and I talk about this in the book, I was raised by activists. I was very critical of Jordan. I spent a lot of time in Chicago. So there was that whole critique then of what was going on in the projects across the street from the Bull Stadium and his political disengagement. And then also with Harvey Gantt, et cetera. And I tried to think about, though, what he conceived of himself as doing as attached to a particular kind of Black political disposition around excellence, right? So there is a way that and I don't mean to suggest that he wasn't, he wasn't at times sort of problematically apolitical, but I believe that he saw his excellence as an assertion of a particular sort, right? Of a deep kind of I am superb. I have mastered this game. Everybody wants to be like me. That is a kind of transcendence of a Jim Crow order into which he was born. I think that in many ways, Jordan was similar to, Albert Murray had a similar kind of sensibility about him. And I think, so we can critique him, but I think that that's relevant to mention, right? What it means to have come of age on the same grounds where his ancestors were enslaved, what it meant to have this kind of, and also he's so country, which people don't talk about. Like, he has a kind of earnest country, a lot of arrogance, but he's also real country. And so I wanted to try to read him honestly in that respect, because I am someone who grew up with you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. It's important to have immaculate presentation and to excel, and that's not an inconsequential sensibility. It may not lead to social transformation, but it means something,
And I mean, at the risk of being too obvious, we as a society have not really spent much time asking why Tom Brady doesn't do much for social activism.
Right.
No. Is that just an unspoken part of American society?
I think it is, but it's also, it's sort of like when people say, well, why do the people who are suffering have to do the work? Well, because we're the ones suffering. So I think the other side of it is, I do think the other side of it is that there is a reason that there's certain expectations. We wish that everybody believed in the beloved community, but there is a sense of responsibility that I think one has when one has an extraordinary, I certainly feel it, right? You have an extraordinary and rare trajectory. What is your responsibility to the people who made it possible for you to be in the position you're in, who are disproportionately suffering? I think that's a fair question to ask. But there was this moment, and I do think it's really meaningful culturally, and I still haven't read anything that completely unpacks it. But, that Be Like Mike moment, that where the notion of transcending race, that actually is a moment where, people talked about it might be possible in the Obama era. That didn't happen. But that moment was pretty dramatic.
We'll be right back. I'm going to cut you off. We'll be right back.
Comes from WFAE members and Home Trust Bank, focused on helping business owners achieve their goals and dedicated to helping communities grow with customized small business and commercial financial services. More info at htb.com. And Mazda of South Charlotte, pledging to help end child hunger of the Carolinas through ongoing support of Second Harvest Food Bank of Metrolina. Details about this initiative at mazdaofsouthcharlotte.com. Last year, Texas passed two very different but very strict sets of restrictions. One applied to voting, the other abortion. Since then, Texas clinics have faced chaos, confusion, and a huge backlog. And voting restrictions face their first big test next Tuesday, as Texas goes to the polls to decide on its next governor. What has the fallout been for these two pieces of controversial legislation? 1A Talks Texas and gets some answers on 20 Minutes on 1A, right after Charlotte Talks.
It's your world. We help you explore it.
In Honduras today, the man who was president until just a few weeks ago will now face a federal judge.
It's your community. We help you understand it.
Washington says local COVID-19 trends are continuing to go in the right direction and says the county needs to plan for dealing with the virus long term.
WFAE's Morning Edition is an essential way to start your day and stay connected to your world. Weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Back on Charlotte Talks, I'm Erik Spanberg in for Mike Collins. We're continuing our conversation with Imani Perry. She is professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and the author of the New York Times bestseller, South to America. And when we last left you, we were talking about being like Mike, and I'm sorry to have cut you off, but go ahead, Imani.
No, I was just saying it was just an interesting moment to think about what it meant for the entire world to want to emulate this man. And I do think that there was a moment as an individual where he transcended race. And I don't know that I don't know that we've thought enough about the meaning of that moment is really all I was going to say. Yeah.
As I mentioned, Charlotte was not on your itinerary this time, although there are always future books, but you did come across one of our greatest exports, and that is Romare Bearden. And you were in Savannah, where you visited Dr. Walter Evans and his wife, Linda, who were the source of your friend David Blight's magnificent biography of Frederick Douglass. But Dr. Evans and his wife are art collectors, and you noticed something immediately about his collection. What did you see?
Well, there is Bearden's extraordinary piece, The Block. And I think there are three of them, but one, I think it's in MoMA in New York, but he has one of Bearden's vast pieces on his wall that is actually, I think, in my estimation, in my humble opinion, even more magnificent than the one in New York. And it is, and part of the meaning of it for me is that, so Bearden painted it from, the gaze is from Albert Murray's apartment in Harlem at Lenox Terrace. So there was like this sort of repetition for me. I went on a pilgrimage to Savannah, saw Bearden's work that came through Albert Murray's window, and Albert Murray was the person who wrote the book that was most directly influential to my own South to a Very Old Place, but also in V.S. Nobel Prize winning Trinidadian writer V.S. Naipaul went on to write his book, A Turn in the South. He took a pilgrimage up to Harlem to look through Murray's window. And also in this, in Bearden, there's a wonderful documentary about Bearden's life, Bearden Plays Bearden, where there's a scene where there is Murray and Bearden and the dancer and founder of the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, and also James Baldwin, who also did two books in which he travels through the South, right? So there's this kind of repetition of a theme. And one of the things that Bearden said, which so impacted me, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the exact quote, but he said, he left Charlotte when he was, I think, 2. And he said, I only ever left Charlotte physically. And that's exactly how I feel about Alabama. And so that sort of the way in which his home shaped everything he did, even though he went up to New York as a small child, resonated so deeply with me, and the kind of the way that he captured the sensibility, the color, the way bodies relate to each other, the kind of tenderness is so much a part of Southern culture, notwithstanding the brutality of so much of its history was just so resonant. So there is a way in which I was trying to get his sensibility in the book.
And I think you draw a distinction of how this particular part of the South impacted him, as opposed to, contemporaries and friends that he had that were from other parts of the South.
Yeah. Well, which part are you talking? I'm sorry.
I'm trying to remember. Was it Murray? It was someone from Georgia, and I apologize, I can't remember. You were contrasting the inland North Carolina perspective with one of his contemporaries, maybe not a painter, but a writer. So I apologize. I forgot to write.
Off the top of my head, it's terrible.
That's fine. I want to go back. I'm not going to ask you entirely about North Carolina, but I do want to ask you about, you talked a little bit about religion and how important it is. You mentioned an H.L. Mencken quote where he says, essentially, North Carolina's hope for progress depends on reducing its religious fervor.
Right.
And I'm curious, you talked earlier about, the different threads of religion, obviously. But do you think that's still the case? Do you think that was ever the case?
No, I don't. I mean, because I don't think that religion cuts one way. And we know that because of the way that it has been the thing that motivates, notions of freedom, right? I mean, so I don't think that it's but it's such a classic, and Mencken didn't think of himself as a Southerner. Depends on how you count, what counts, how you got Maryland.
But he's from Baltimore, and we know Maryland.
Yes, Baltimore. Yes. So, but I know I never thought that was the case. I do think that the question of whether religion will be used as a sword or a shield is this sort of ongoing question, and particularly now, as all these states are targeting trans kids in particular under the guise of religion, but it's really about a kind of fear mongering that makes people point at those who are vulnerable instead of their own vulnerability. And so can we rethink how religion might be is the question. And that's always been the question. But I will also say that if we think that faith can and should, and I believe this, be an occasion for us to witness the wonder and have a kind of humility vis-a-vis the planet we occupy. So that when we talk about the trees older than Jesus, right? That should make us sort of step back from the sort of assertions about who's good and who's bad, and actually sort of treat it as a kind of anchor in an unsure world, and see our role as protecting this land, right? So I and maybe that is naive, but I hope that it can function in a different way, and will, right?
And you draw a contemporary contrast between the Reverend William Barber, who, of course, is a North Carolinian, was the former president of the state NAACP, and what was going on in Raleigh with the governor and the state legislature. You had the infamous bathroom bill and some of the other policies. What do you make when you sort of throw those things together into the cauldron? Is that, again, emblematic of America writ large?
Yes. I mean, so this is, so interesting, because right now we're in this moment where there's a kind of set of competing mythologies about the nation, right? So one is a kind of, we might say, is a kind of a lost cause mythology, and then which I find disturbing. But there's another mythology, the kind of ever more perfect, towards a more perfect union mythology, which I think can be just as damaging. The reality is that we have had this fundamental tension from the beginning between the ideals of sort of the promise of an incredible landscape, right? The promise of what each person might be, the sort of ideals of democracy. And then on the other hand, the kind of greed and an acquisition in the service of selfishness that actually leads to human suffering. These tensions continue, right? So it's not one story, and it's not a linear story, right? There is a fundamental tension between what we think is the kind of right human relation to occupy. And so I think that to say that, and to try to cut off one side of the story either way, I think gets us in dangerous territory. We should talk about, these have been these crises, these tensions, these conflicts since the beginning. I think that Reverend Barber in particular, both because of his moral courage, but his desire to reach into sort of partner with people with identities other than his own, his transparency about his disability, for me is a person who helps us understand what lies on this, what the beloved community made manifest might be. And I find that very inspiring.
That's the voice of Imani Perry. She is the author of the new book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. And I wanted to ask you if you would read a little bit from your chapter on Washington, D.C. This is a section where you are talking a little bit about the history that we tell ourselves.
Yes. After all, when American exceptionalism is extolled, it requires us to set aside genocide, slavery, colonialism, and all manner of shameful deeds to trumpet national honor. And when the ugliness is brought up, you can always expect the men of their time line will be dropped, as though accountability for destruction has an expiration date. But a distinction is made when speaking about the South in this regard. The South is not afforded that troubling grace except when we are talking about that legion of Southern founding fathers. They are counted differently. And here's why. I think, as I stated before, there is a consensus that the South is supposed to bear the brunt of the shame and that the nation's sins are disposed upon it. So the South in the founding is muted. But if we are to tell the truth about how central the region is to all of us, we have to be honest about the shared habits of the past and their justification. I myself have made the distinction between the sins of the founding fathers and the Confederacy by saying the lost cause is worse because they celebrate traitors to the nation. But that is, in a sense, a victor's skewed logic and not compelling even to me. The Revolutionary War soldiers were traitors to the crown. We celebrated otherwise only because they won and we became what followed. In a sense, Martin Luther King Jr. on the Mall is a subtle corrective to the sins in the faith of the fathers when it came to the social order. The Black Southerner is, in him, included in the national architecture. One might read this as a path toward the ever more perfect union. One might read this as a means of legitimating the earlier half-truths. I don't think an either-or conclusion is necessary. What does occur to me, however, is that any monument is, in a sense, both an icon and a grave, a burial vault in which the messiness of history is often dispensed with for the sake of the imagined community. And that should always concern us.
Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, when you are in Washington, D.C. or these other travels, I'm generalizing a little bit here, but what do you tend to feel? Do you feel angry? Do you feel sad? Do you feel resignation? Is it a trudge through history for you?
Oh, no. I mean, honestly, well, not as much DC, but the further south I go, I feel so glad. I mean, I've been so, and it's hard to tour now because of COVID and everything, but I feel comforted. I feel familiar. I feel like, there's so much that is sorrowful, right? And that is the nature of history, but I feel as though I know how to be in a way that makes it manageable. When I talk to folks on the street, when there's pleasantries exchanged, when there's a kind of grace in living, it makes it feel as though, they're moving through history. There is still some grace. There's still some sweetness, right? So I don't want to say that in a way that sounds Pollyanna-ish because it's not. But this is just the fact of where we are, where we've been. But how do we make do? How do we live through it is both, I think, the hard work of confronting history and working towards justice, but it's also the daily work of finding some grace.
One of the places that you visit in your home state is Bryan Stevenson's lynching memorial. And I'm guessing that you're very familiar with his call for monuments and markers telling the story not only of racial strife and conflict, but heroic civil rights leaders, people, Black, white, and otherwise, who are trying to move society forward. Do you think that would help? And do you have hope that it will happen to any degree?
I do think it will happen. I'm not against monuments. I just think that whatever we do, I'm always worried. Monuments can become, there's lots of places where monuments are sort of inconsequential, where they're just places where birds do their business. And so I don't know that
that's another book.
Right? But I don't know that the monument itself is the thing, right? I mean, part of the way, the impact of EJI has everything to do with its larger context, the one exit away from the Confederate Museum, the history of Montgomery, the narrative that they build around it. And I think, so whatever our natural environment is, right? Whatever, or our built environment rather, it is, the meaning comes from the use, right? The meaning comes from our relationship to it. So I think that I have more faith in the way that we are trying to tell more complicated stories about our past and our present and trying to draw connections than the built environment, which is not suggest I'm opposed to more building, but I just don't know that that's not where I place most of my energy. Yeah.
With just a little bit of time left, I am curious, are there 2, 3, 4 places you would name that you really wanted to get to that you didn't?
Oh yeah, I wanted to go back to Arkansas, and I had a whole Arkansas chapter. I also had a Houston chapter, and I couldn't go back, and I just was like, I don't know enough. Like, I had a chapter of driving through Houston. So the book ends in Houston, but like that, I was so interested. I wanted to go back to, I wanted to actually be able to interview people from Chinese community in Mississippi, multi-generational Chinese community in Mississippi, and also Vietnamese folks in Louisiana. So there's a lot of places that because of COVID, I could not return to, or conversations that I didn't have. So I'm hoping that, at some point I'll get to all those places, and absolutely Columbia, South Carolina.
There's a lot to sift through there. Imani Perry, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you so much.
Again, Imani Perry is professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Her book is called South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, and it is a New York Times bestseller. I want to thank you for listening and joining us today. For Mike Collins, I'm Erik Spanberg. Thanks for listening to Charlotte Talks.
I have another interview right away, so I'm going to hop off. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes